It was a tale of two leaders once again tonight. President Zelensky made another desperate appeal to the world for help. If we fall, he said, Europe falls. Meanwhile, as Russia's forces attacked a nuclear facility, not to mention civilians all over Ukraine,
Никаких недобрых намерений в отношении наших соседей.
Vladimir Putin told the world with a straight face that Russia had no bad intentions to its neighbours and international relations should be normalised soon. On another packed programme tonight. How close were we to nuclear catastrophe? Dan has the story of the attack on one of Ukraine's nuclear reactors.
The fighting on the other side of the Dnieper River here highlights the potentially terrifying consequences of war in a country with 15 nuclear reactors.
A major crackdown in Russia itself. Faced with draconian punishments for telling the truth, staff at an independent station walk out and other journalists rush to leave the country. New legislation is on its way here, so will the oligarchs finally see their assets seized? He may crush Ukraine, but he'll never hold it. A former head of the CIA tells me the war is not going well for the Russian leader.
At the end of the day, I am not sure that the Russians can continue to control areas that they seize, given that the entire population at this point absolutely loathes them.
As the conflict sends the price of wheat soaring, the UN warns it could take global hunger to levels never seen before. And he was, for many, simply a cricketing genius. Shane Warne passes away at the age of only 52.
It was his character and the way he played the game. He was a showman on the pitch. People would empty the bars to come and watch Shane Warne bowl.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. There is no knowing, of course, how Vladimir Putin's unprovoked and indiscriminate assault on Ukraine will end. Should his troops eventually fight their way into Kiev and topple the government, what then? Moscow says occupation is off the cards, but then it said that about the invasion. The president of the country Mr. Putin is attacking and whose people he is killing doesn't believe he will stop there. In a warning to the world tonight, Volodymyr Zelensky said that if Ukraine falls, the rest of Europe will be next. His appeal for help was in stark contrast to Mr. Putin's latest address, in which he made the remarkable claim that Russia had no bad intentions towards its neighbours. That on a day when his troops opened fire on a nuclear power plant, more on that shortly, and continued to unleash hell on the innocent citizens of Ukraine.
One by one, Ukrainian cities are coming under bombardment. This time it's the turn of Zhytomyr, west of Kiev, about as far west as Russian forces have so far come. By day 9 of this war, the pictures have become no less damning for the fact they're so familiar. As ever, civilian buildings in civilian areas flattened, apparently for no better reason than to destroy Ukrainian morale and the fabric of their society. Vitaly Dankevich is a pillar of that society, a teacher, a family man, now sheltering at home in Zhytomyr in fear for what may happen to his wife and children.
We are a very small country, but with very brave people. And these brave people try to fight. We try to fight and we have success. But I don't know a time for which we can do this fight.
Outside the southern city of Mariupol, the Russians have released pictures of the wreckage of the Ukrainian defences. We're seeing little from the inside, but the besieged deputy mayor has got this message out.
So city is surrounded by Russian troops from 3 directions. So in fact, city is blocked. Internally, city is controlled by Ukrainian army and Ukrainian National Guard and police. Putin and Russian army totally destroyed all infrastructure. I mean, city lives for 3 days without electricity, without water, sanitary systems.
In the information war, however, the Ukrainians are winning victory after victory. These scenes in Prague tonight are one of many huge rallies, addressed by President Zelensky by video. He spoke simultaneously to Bratislava, Berlin, Tbilisi, Frankfurt, to name a few. And the message, if this isn't stopped, it'll happen to you. I would like to call on you not to be silent, he urged them. Come out on the streets and support Ukraine, because if Ukraine will not stand, Europe will not stand. If we fall, you will fall. What a contrast with Vladimir Putin, speaking again from the isolation of the Kremlin and making a frankly bizarre suggestion that we should all just get back to normal.
We have no bad intentions towards our neighbors. We do not see any need here to aggravate or worsen our relations. I think that everyone should think about how to normalize relations and cooperate normally.
Cooperate normally. After this, the seeds of hatred that have been sown here in just over a week will be reaped by the Russians for a generation. They may win, but the prize will be little more than a shattered land emptied of millions of its people. James Mates, News at 10, Kiev.
Well, the greatest fear is that this conflict escalates into an apocalyptic nuclear war. But the world was faced with another nightmare scenario last night. Advancing in southern Ukraine, Russian forces sent shells hurtling towards Europe's largest nuclear power plant. A fire broke out and there were fears of a disaster on a scale none of us have witnessed in modern times. Mercifully, the site appears stable, albeit under Russian control. Moscow was accused of nuclear terrorism, and we were all reminded of just how high the stakes really are.
Today there was no outward sign of the battle which had raged around Europe's biggest nuclear power station. But footage inside the complex gives a chilling glimpse into the nuclear Russian roulette playing out at Enerhodar as the bullets and shells flew. The moment a column of Russian troops arrived was filmed by a worker at the plant. After dark, flares were fired to illuminate their targets. Volleys of bullets slamming into buildings near the reactors. Here you can see how close disaster was. These walkways between the reactors appear to have been punctured by shrapnel, making a mockery of an agreement between Ukraine and Russia to put a 30-kilometre safe zone around nuclear facilities. One building used for training was set alight by the fighting. The consequences of the fire spreading don't bear thinking about. Today, the International Atomic Energy Authority confirmed the plant itself remains undamaged.
All the safety systems of the 6 reactors at the plant were not affected at all, and that there has been no release of radioactive material. No release of radioactive material.
In Nikopol, across the river from the plant, the memories of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986 still linger with the old and haunt the thoughts of the young who've watched the dramatization on TV. Are you worried that something terrible could happen?
Yes, we all, especially older people just they know what was in Chernobyl, and now they just fear because it can be again. It can be again.
The fighting on the other side of the Dnieper River here highlights the potentially terrifying consequences of war in a country with 15 nuclear reactors. 6 of them are here at this one power station. Today, President Zelensky underlined what a stray shell could mean.
Російські війська атакували Запорізьку атомну станцію.
Russian troops attacked the biggest nuclear plant in Europe, Zaporizhia. It alone could be as dangerous as 6 Chernobyls. The Russian tanks knew what they were shelling, directly pointing at the station. This is terror on an unprecedented level.
It's not just a threat to Ukraine. It could send a radioactive cloud across much of Europe. Once again, the world is realizing this war has global consequences. Dan Rivers, News at 10, Eastern Ukraine.
Well, let's look now at how the conflict is developing 9 days after the invasion. Russia is believed to control the shaded areas seen here, which includes, of course, one of Ukraine's 4 main nuclear power stations. A Ministry of Defense source here says that 5 cities have been completely surrounded by Russian forces. One of them, Mariupol, continues to face a particularly fierce bombardment. Much of its infrastructure has already been destroyed. Well, let's go back and speak to James, who is in Kiev tonight. James, with the kind of attacks we're seeing, their brutality, their recklessness, it seems that Mr. Putin is continuing to up the ante.
Yeah, and particularly after what we saw last night around the nuclear plant as well. I mean, people are really beginning to worry now about if this war continues to go badly for Vladimir Putin, if it even goes worse, does he back down, show weakness? He absolutely never has in the past. He's always doubled down. I mean, as Dan was saying there, just yesterday they were talking about protecting nuclear sites, and then last night his commanders do that, and it raises the spectrum. I mean, if they'll do that, what won't they do? And things are not going well for the Russians still. I mean, there are reports, perhaps I should say claims, because they're impossible to confirm at the moment, that on the outskirts of Kiev here, the Russians are actually being pushed back somewhat. And what is undoubtedly good news for those of us in the city is that column, which for 4 or 5 days we've watched on as it approached Kiev. Well, the satellite pictures that are coming out most recently today suggest that column has barely moved, if at all. It is more or less stuck in a 30-40 mile traffic jam. Now that, President Putin said today that the war was going exactly as planned. If he planned to put all his forces in a long traffic jam and leave them there for a week, well, it was a curious sort of plan.
OK, James, thank you very much indeed. Well, an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council was called today after the attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. And Emma joins us from Washington. Emma, I'm guessing the US president, indeed all world leaders, are watching this extremely closely.
Yes, indeed. It was just after 8 last night and the reports started to come through of this firefight at the nuclear plant. The president was informed straight away here at the White House, and he brought in his nuclear advisors to try and establish what was going on. There was then a hastily arranged phone call to President Zelensky, but to be perfectly honest, both men knew little more than the rest of us just watching it on the TV, because the information was lost amid the battle. It was after that that the UN Security Council meeting was requested by the UK, and they met in emergency session this morning. Those in the Western Alliance spoke of their horror and how they'd held their breaths watching those images last night. The American ambassador to the UN said that it was only by the grace of God that the world avoided nuclear catastrophe last night, and she described holding her breath and waiting to exhale as she watched what was going on. But of course the UN is so powerless in this situation that for all the talk, for all the condemnation, all of which was, by the way, dismissed by the Russian ambassador, there was nothing that they could do to make a tangible difference on the ground. The most they could ask for was a cessation of fighting, and if they couldn't get that, at least a cessation of fighting around Ukraine's nuclear reactors.
OK, Emma, thank you very much indeed. Well, since the invasion, the Kremlin has been clamping down on independent media in Russia, which doesn't toe the line that its actions in Ukraine should be described as a special military operation. Today, a law was passed targeting anyone spreading what it deems to be fake information about the war, an act now punishable by up to 15 years in prison. In response, the BBC, which has a Russian language service and has been accused by Moscow of undermining stability, has temporarily suspended its work there. ITV News, along with several other broadcasters, has chosen to continue to report from Russia for now.
Anger at Russia's actions in Ukraine echo against the Kremlin's walls. The anti-war protests continue. Over the past week, more than 8,000 people have been arrested across this country. Those calling for people to join in now face 5 years in prison. Supporting calls for sanctions carries 3 years in a forced labour camp. What little independent media there was here has also been silenced. Staff at this TV channel walked out after it was closed down by the authorities. They then showed Swan Lake, the ballet played during the 1991 coup, which led to the end of the Soviet Union. One of the channel's presenters who spoke to me last week has now left Russia, fearing for his safety. He says he's in disbelief at what's happened.
It's the spectacle of your home country, of the state, of the way of life of the whole nation, the nation itself maybe just falling apart in front of your eyes in days.
Russia's parliament today passed new laws which could see journalists imprisoned for up to 15 years for spreading what it calls false information. The Kremlin insists the media describe what's happening in Ukraine as a, quote, special military operation. Police raided the offices of a prominent human rights organization in Moscow today as the voices of opposition in Russia continue to be smothered. Another independent journalist who's left the country spoke of his decision.
You know, it just really felt dangerous to stay in Russia, and there is a lot of rumors circling about the military draft that is supposedly going to happen, but you know there is no information. But if you're a young man, it sounds like it might be a bit risky for you to stay in the country.
President Putin insists that everything is going to plan in Ukraine. These new strict laws introduced today show the Kremlin's determination to ensure that its version of events dominates here. Neil Connery, News at 10, Moscow.
The British government today promised to do more to target Russian oligarchs following criticism it hasn't been nearly tough enough on them. It comes after French authorities have been showing off a yacht they seized yesterday near Marseille, which was owned by an ally of Vladimir Putin. And Carl joins me to discuss all this. Look, the British government, I think it's fair to say, has been under a bit of pressure. I mean, I think people here really want to see the oligarchs having their assets seized. Why aren't we seizing yachts?
Well, the government would say that if a sanctioned individual tried to take a yacht out of the UK, they could have seized it. But the truth is, they couldn't have seized that particular yacht because the guy who owns it isn't sanctioned here. And there has been a perceived problem with the number of oligarchs being sanctioned. When you ask the government why we're not sanctioning so many so quickly, they first of all say, well, we are moving quickly, but then they give you reasons why they're not moving so quickly. One, they say they started with banks, big financial centre, makes sense. And then two, they say the law makes it more difficult. Now, lawyers certainly dispute that. In any event, the government is going to bring in legislation next week. It's amending some of its own legislation, the Economic Crime Bill, to make it much easier to start sanctioning oligarchs and to copy sanctions over, copy and paste, if you like, from other countries. But that is still only talking about freezing assets. That's not actually taking them away and seizing them, which can still only happen if somebody tries to move on a frozen asset. And we're still a couple of steps away from that. Why is it not happening more quickly? Well, the opposition think because the government is too close, the Conservatives are too close to some Russians. The government vehemently deny that. But actually, I spoke to a senior Conservative tonight who said that he actually thinks the Tory party is too close to a number of Russian donors.
Corrosive stuff. All right, Carl, thank you very much indeed. Now, still to come, a warning that global hunger levels could reach new levels as wheat prices rise rapidly amid the invasion of Ukraine. And after cricket, Shane Warne dies at 52. Tributes from the man he bamboozled with the so-called ball of the century.
He will always be remembered probably as the greatest leg spinner in the Test history so far.
Those stories and more after this break. Welcome back. One question many people are asking, as we did earlier, is if Vladimir Putin takes control of large parts or indeed all of Ukraine, what happens next? It was something I discussed with General David Petraeus earlier today, a man who knows more than most about the subject, having overseen US operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and then gone on to be head of the CIA. But I began by asking him for his assessment of last night's attack on Europe's largest nuclear power plant.
It was unbelievably reckless. It was crazy. It was foolish. It was dumb. Thankfully, that particular battle is over. The engineers are still in control of that plant. It didn't melt down. Keep in mind, of course, this is a country that has a history of a meltdown, one of the worst ever, in Chernobyl, far to the north. So again, another example of the Russians just disregarding what would be normal restrictions, constraints, rules of engagement.
Can I just ask you to give me your assessment of the military situation as you see it in Ukraine tonight?
Well, what we see is a series of gains for the Russians in the south, although I think it's doubtful whether they can truly hold those. They've had a hard time bringing their forces to bear. They've shown an inability to combine ground and air operations to achieve effects. They haven't even achieved combined arms effects between infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers. And again, as I said, the Ukrainian forces have performed magnificently. And keep in mind that when you're defending from an urban area, the rule of thumb in the military is it probably takes 5 to 1 for the attacker to make progress in that situation, which is in fact why the Russians have been resorting to increasingly barbaric, heinous, often reckless attacks on civilian infrastructure, including, of course, the nuclear power plant. I'd also make one other point, if I could, Tom, and that is that the Russians may be able to take cities basically by destroying them in some cases, depopulating them, scaring women and children out of them. Over 1 million Poles, or 1 million have already gone into Poland, for example, and the other Eastern European countries in a week. I mean, that's just extraordinary. But at the end of the day, I am not sure that the Russians can continue to control areas that they seize. I don't know how in the world they control Ukraine, given that the entire population at this point absolutely loathes them. And many of the adults in the population, female as well as male, are willing to take actions against them, whether it's Molotov cocktails, taking up a rifle, supporting the military in some fashion.
And that's, I guess, my final question. If the Ukrainians get pushed west and are fighting an insurgency either from that part of their country or increasingly being pushed over into the border to, say Poland, and it's clear that NATO is funding this insurgency, is that in truth the realistic flashpoint we've got to worry about?
Not necessarily. Again, this wouldn't have to be overt. Obviously, there are covert action options that I'm confident are being explored by my old comrades at a government agency here in Washington. And again, there are various ways that you can do that. It does help enormously if they can control part of the country so that the resistance comes from that part, and so that assistance can be provided on the ground, presumably, into that part of Ukraine from which the guerrilla insurgent campaign could be conducted.
General David Petraeus speaking to me a little earlier today. Now, the conflict's effects are already rippling well beyond the towns and cities where it's being fought. Tonight, there was a warning from the UN's World Food Programme that it could take global hunger to levels beyond anything seen before. Now, that is in part because Russia and Ukraine account for a third of global wheat exports, a market which is now in crisis. In a month, the global trading price has almost doubled, and since the invasion has gone from $8 to $12 a bushel. And Joel, as you would expect, is here to talk about all this. Look, I know the bad news, unfortunately for everyone watching this programme, just keeps on coming, but there's no way around this. This is pretty serious as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's easy to forget, Tom, that this war is being fought on the dark, rich, fertile soil of a region known as the breadbasket of Europe. You've got a situation here where Russia and Ukraine produce enough food in abundance to feed themselves and feed other countries too. And we've got a situation here where the price of wheat, barley, corn, vegetable oil has soared, along with the price of oil and gas, which has got a lot of attention. Now, the Western sanctions don't apply directly to foods, but there are massive problems getting cargo out of the Black Sea region. We can show you a map now which will basically illustrate how vessels were moving across European waters as of a few hours ago. If we zoom into the Black Sea region, you can see just how deserted Ukraine's ports are. Yesterday, in fact, a cargo ship was sunk off the coast of Odessa following an explosion. Shipping companies, insurers, banks, they're avoiding the coastal waters of what is effectively a war zone. Now, this conflict will inevitably push up prices in supermarkets across Europe, but the consequences for parts of northern Africa and the Middle East are far, far graver, catastrophic, in fact. You've got places in the world like Iraq, like Syria, like Egypt, which have massive populations, which rely on bread in the same way, actually, as they rely on access to clean water.
This rush to find wheat across the world is not going to be satisfied in such a short period of time, and that can put real stresses on the existing stockpiles in some of these countries, to the extent that you're effectively rationing food, you're suffering severe food insecurity and starvation.
The UN's World Food Programme, Tom, is looking at the spike in market prices, sounding the alarm because it knows what's coming down the tracks. Putin's war in Ukraine is causing ripples and devastations far, far, far across Europe and beyond.
OK, Joel, for now, thank you. All right, let's move away from Ukraine for just a moment to the tragic story of Kirill Matthews, a happy, smiley child who was killed by his mother and her ex-partner after repeated attacks. The 2-year-old had suffered 41 rib fractures and internal bleeding, which ultimately caused his death in October 2019. Kemar Brown was convicted of Kirill's murder, while his mother, Filzia Shirley, was found guilty of manslaughter. Now, with his very first Ashes delivery, Shane Warne left England's Mike Gatting in utter disbelief, dismissing him with what became known as cricket ball of the century. It was a feeling players the world over became familiar with when facing Warne. He was a character impossible to ignore on and indeed off the field. So there was huge shock today when it was announced he died aged 52 after a suspected heart attack.
You can argue whether he's the best ever or not, but there's no disputing Shane Warne was a rare cricketing superstar who changed his sport. A genius with ball in hand, a maverick who always played with a smile on his face.
It was his character and the way he played the game. He was a showman on the pitch. People would empty the bars to come and watch Shane Warne bowl.
His first ever ball in Ashes cricket, an omen for batters everywhere. He'd torment them for years to come. The bleached blonde with an ear stud and a box full of tricks to bamboozle even the best.
Well, the only great thing was that he didn't just get sort of 39 test wickets, he got 700 and plus 10 test wickets, and he will always be remembered probably as the greatest leg spinner in the test history.
For more than a decade, he was the spearhead of a rarely beaten Australian team, and during that time earned rock star status. He was invaluable in the game's short form too, always aggressive and always experimenting. On the pitch, he had several brushes with the authorities. Off it, he lived a colourful, hard-partying and high-profile existence. That included an engagement to model Liz Hurley.
Oh no, come on.
And he proved a lively guest on reality TV shows. But he was never far from a cricket pitch, passing on his knowledge and enthusiasm to the next generation.
My experiences of Shane was someone that absolutely loved the game of cricket. It was always a joy to be around, gave so much energy to the sport, and obviously as a kid growing up was a massive idol of mine.
Australia woke up this morning to find out they'd lost one of their favourite sons. It is a tragic irony that only yesterday in Thailand, Warne posted a message about the death of another Australian cricket legend, Rodney Marsh. At 52, Shane Warne was far too young to leave, but what time he did have, he certainly lived to the full.
I liked loud music, I was smoked, I drank, and I bowled a bit of leg spin, you know, that was sort of me. I don't have any regrets.
Shane Warne, who's died, sadly, at the age of 52. Well, let's go back to Ukraine now, and Robert is here to talk about all this. Robert, when I joined this organisation 32 years ago, you were the Moscow correspondent, and you were covering this immensely hopeful thing, the wall coming down, the Soviet Union collapsing. I feel like we're going in the reverse direction from what we've heard today in Russia.
That's right. I mean, we're focusing rightly on the violence in Ukraine, which is, of course, off the charts. The suffering there is almost beyond imagination. But there is a parallel tragedy in Russia. The shimmering lights that I and others were lucky enough to witness 30 years ago in the final years of Gorbachev and the opening years of the Yeltsin years, those sort of intoxicating moments when we believed that Russia was pivoting towards being outward-looking and liberal in its direction of travel, those lights are essentially being extinguished tonight. It feels like the end of a 30-year experiment in independent journalism and freedom of expression. Some of the great Russian newspapers like Novaya Gazeta are being censored. Great radio stations, TV stations are being closed down. And in its place is this palpably absurd Kremlin narrative. And many Russians, therefore, are facing not just economic isolation, but also cultural isolation as well. Putin, it feels, is almost ripping Russia away from the European family. And Tom, we lose something from that too. We lose this sense that Russia is part of the European family. So a tragedy on so many levels, both in Ukraine and in Russia.
OK, well, I have picked Robert's brains at length for a podcast which we have recorded. This is it, what you need to know. Do go and download it and listen. Now, finally, it's hard to believe this terrible conflict is just 9 days old, a time in which the world has changed forever. Above all, the Ukrainian people have experienced what none of us thought even remotely possible in 21st century Europe, and yet still show such remarkable courage and resilience.
It's awful war. We are crying every day, every night. We are crying every day.
Wow.
I want ending this right now because people dying.
Mama.
Images that will stay with us for a long time, and the horror goes on. That's it. Have a great weekend.